Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the time that France almost invaded Ireland, focusing specifically on the Bantry Bay invasion in December of 1796. So, we've talked about the Society of United Irishmen a little bit. I want to go back, refresh ourselves on some things, and talk about one of its founders, Theobald Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone was born in 1763 and is remembered by many as the father of Irish republicanism. Though he was born a Protestant, he was disillusioned with Ireland's political landscape and the treatment of Roman Catholics. In 1791, he co founded the Society of United Irishmen with two other Protestants. The society aimed to, quote, unite Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter under the common name of Irishmen in order to break the connection with England, the never failing source of all our political evils. The thing that it stressed most was unity among all Irish people against English. In 1795, the United Irishmen were chased underground, and a government crackdown ensued. Wolfe Tone went into exile in America to escape arrest. While in America, he began to mingle with French diplomats, increasing correspondence, and eventually he would go on to suggest a full military alliance between the French and the Irish. So, from France's perspective, why invade? As we've talked about a lot in this class, Ireland has been seen by many countries at many points in time as Britain's weak point. It's lightly defended, politically unstable, and is much further from Britain's main naval concentration. It would be much easier for France to strike without facing Britain's full military strength. French ministers strongly believed that detaching Ireland would cripple Britain's naval power and control, ultimately reducing it to a second rate power. A landing in Ireland would also force Britain to divert ships and troops away from the European mainland, which would shift the overall balance of the war in France's favor. The war being the French Revolutionary Wars, which the French and English were currently fighting. The invasion was relatively low cost, high reward, at least compared to some of the other alternatives. They already had an internal ally in the Society of United Irishmen, and they believed that once they had got to Ireland, it would be relatively easy to get the Irish people on board with them. Generally, supporting an Irish revolt aligned with France's broader revolutionary strategy of weakening monarchies through foreign republican movements. Here was the proposed plan: 43 ships, 13,975 veteran French troops. 17 of these ships would be ships of the line, which are kind of like the big guns. 13 of these frigates. It was going to be commanded by General Lazare Hoche and Vice Admiral Moran de Galles. They would be commanding from the flagship Fraternity. Upon departure, the fleet would first sail south through the Ras de Seine, which was a very treacherous channel that many ships would take on their way to Portugal, and then loop back up north. And the theory behind this is that by first going through the Ras de Seine, they would trick any surveying British ships into thinking that the fleet was heading to Portugal. And then, once they got past, they would turn north over to Ireland. They were originally planned to depart in September, but due to a multitude of different delays, they wouldn't depart until December. Unfortunately, there were a lot of issues they encountered in their approach to Bantry Bay. Within just hours of leaving the port of Brest, several ships collided and got lost in the fog. Some of them returned, and the rest became split and uncoordinated. One of the largest ships in the fleet ran aground while going through that channel that I had mentioned earlier, the Ras de Seine. The flagship, Fraternity, which was carrying both General Hoche and Admiral Morand, was blown back towards France and would ultimately return to the port of Brest. Regardless of what happened going forward, the fleet would now be entering Bantry Bay without its senior command. When the ships first arrived at Bantry Bay, Irish pilots boarded the French ships, believing them to be British. Nobody on the island was aware that a French fleet was on its way to Ireland. Now, the Irish pilots were quite friendly, and they confirmed that there was no British naval presence, and that the French faced no military barrier to landing, and they helped guide them safely into the bay. By December 22nd, 15 ships had made it to Bantry Bay. Unfortunately, they would go on to encounter some more failure. Around December 23rd, 24th, a strong easterly gale blew straight out of Bantry Bay. The ships inside the bay couldn't maneuver, they couldn't launch boats, they were effectively stuck. Some of the specific things that happened: the 32-gun frigate Resolute collided with a much smaller vessel in the dark and heavy seas. She launched a longboat to tow it, but both were washed ashore and lost. On the boat was a prominent lieutenant and hundreds of crew, which were subsequently captured by loyal forces ashore. The ships that had yet to enter the bay and were still sitting offshore were forced to drop their anchor as the gale turned into a very fierce storm. Many of these ships would be blown back into the Atlantic because their anchors weren't catching, and many would eventually return to France. On December 24th, the remaining 6,500 troops and their ships were planning to move up north about 200 miles to Sligo Bay. Unfortunately, that night the winds would increase, and this plan would quickly become infeasible. On December 25th, the weather and fog was so bad that the ships could barely see each other. The new commander, General de Grouchy, the ship he was on collided with Wolfe Tones. The general then shouted orders for the ships to cut cables and return to the open sea, and many would go on to follow their lead. Between December 26th and 27th, only 7 ships remained in Bantry Bay. A few, as I had mentioned before, attempted to head up to Sligo Bay, but they were quickly battered in the storm and would turn back to France. Many of the ships that were in Bantry Bay on the morning of the 26th would leave and successfully make progress north, ultimately mooring at the mouth of Shannon. On December 28th, while anchored in Shannon, winds would pick up again to hurricane levels, and the ship that Wolfe Tone was on, which was still following the fleet, would nearly sink. On December 29th, the order is officially given for all ships to return to France, and the mission is marked a complete failure. I think one of the best quotes that encapsulates all of this and how close yet far they were is this from Wolfe Tone's own diary. We were close enough to throw a biscuit ashore. So, a little bit about the British reactions and some of the French regrets. The British were obviously shocked that such a massive French fleet had reached Bantry Bay undetected, and exposed major failures in coastal defense. British officers would later admit that if the French had even landed a few thousand of their men, there would have been almost no resistance. Per this quote from a British officer, they had less than 3,000 men, 2 pieces of artillery, no magazine of any kind, no firings, no hospital, no provisions, and all but 2 days to prepare. In France, the returning officers and soldiers saw the operation as a near victory. They believed that it was lost to a series of unfortunate events, such as weather and their missing commanders, and not to British action. Tone was understandably very furious and devastated, and fully convinced that a landing would have changed the future of Ireland. So, a little bit about the failed follow ups. In 1798, French General Jean Joseph Humbert landed with just over 1,000 men in Killaloe Bay during the 1798 Rising. They actually went on to win a very surprising victory against the British at Castlebar, and a few smaller ones in some towns, but their force was ultimately too small and too isolated to really change the rebellion. Humbert proclaimed a very short-lived Republic of Connaught, which lasted for about 14 days, but the expedition was eventually surrounded in Ballinamuck and was forced to surrender. Just a few months later, French Admiral Jean-Baptiste Bompard and Wolfe Tone, this time, attempted to ferry 3,000 French troops to Ireland with a 10-ship fleet. However, en route, they are spotted by the Royal British Navy, and a pretty big battle ensues. The French, having been completely caught off guard in very bad weather and a dark environment, were decisively defeated. 8 of their 10 ships were either captured or sunk. Unfortunately, one of these 8 ships was carrying Wolfe Tone. Now, he was captured and was taken to Dublin and put on trial by court martial. There, he insisted on being treated as a French officer rather than a British subject, but the court would not abide. Tone was sentenced to death by hanging instead of being shot as a soldier, and was labeled a traitor. Before the execution could be carried out, though, Tone would cut his own throat in prison and would die a few days later. So, why Bantry Bay and the French plans for invasions matter? As we've talked about before, Ireland's defenses were very clearly weak enough that a major French fleet of 15,000 troops was able to reach Bantry Bay virtually unopposed. Now, this very quickly forced Britain to reinforce Ireland, expand their garrisons and intensify their suppression of nationalist groups. Now, as we know, this is something that the British had been doing for centuries at this point, and it's something that they've already had a lot of issue in, something that's been very expensive, that's been very hard to carry out. Um, on the other side, this episode convinced many Irish nationalists, and not just Irish nationalists, but people internationally, that foreign support in the fight for Irish independence or the fight for Ireland against Britain was possible. It helped to radicalize the movement and greatly contributed to the sentimentality during the 1798 rebellion. And this anxiety would grow to be so great that Britain, in 1800, would pass the Act of Union to pursue even tighter political control by bringing Ireland entirely under its rule. Now, even though this invasion and the subsequent invasions went on to not be successful, I think it is important to consider how major this was. You know, nearly 15,000 French troops being sent over, on almost 50 ships with a really well decorated general, having worked on a plan for months. I mean, it's something that if things had gone a different route, could have been very successful from the perspective of the French. And, this seems like in the grand scheme of things, especially around the 1798 rebellion, a kind of small part of it. But it absolutely had the potential to be something much, much bigger. And I think that's one of the things that makes this so fascinating.